Just as little has consciousness itself existence, for the objective aspect does not succeed in becoming something negative of the actual self, in the same way as this self does not reach complete actuality. It lacks force to externalize itself, the power to make itself a thing and endure existence. It lives in dread of staining the radiance of its inner being by action and existence, and to preserve the purity of its heart, it flees from contact with actuality and steadfastly perseveres in the state of self-willed impotence to renounce a self which is pared away to the last point of abstraction, and to give itself substantial existence, or in other words, to transform its thought into being and commit itself to absolute distinction, that between thought and being. This hollow object which it produces now fills it, therefore, with the feeling of emptiness. Its activity consists in yearning, which merely loses itself in becoming an unsubstantial, shadowy object, and rising above this loss and falling back on itself, finds itself merely as lost. In this transparent purity of its movements, it becomes a sorrow-laden, beautiful soul, as it is called. Its light dims and dies within it, and it vanishes as a shapeless vapor dissolving into thin air. The act of judging, however, has also to be looked at as a positive act of thought, and has a positive content. This aspect makes the contradiction present in the apprehending consciousness and its identity with the first consciousness still more complete. The active consciousness declares its specific deed to be its duty, and the consciousness that passes judgment cannot deny this, for a duty as such is form void of all content and capable of any. In other words, concrete action, inherently implying diversity in its many-sidedness, involves the universal aspect, which is that which, taken as duty, just as much as the particular, which constitutes the share and interest the individual has in the act. Now, the judging consciousness does not stop at the former aspect of duty and rest content with the knowledge which the active agent has of this, viz., that this is his duty, the condition and status of his reality. It holds on to the other aspect and diverts the act into the inner realm, and explains the act from selfish motives and from its inner intention, an intention different from the act itself. As every act is capable of treatment in respect of its dutifulness, so too each can be considered from this other point of view of particularity. For as an act it is the reality of an individual. The process of judging then takes the act out of the sphere of its objective existence and turns its back into the inner subjective sphere, into the form of private or individual particularity. If the act carries glory with it, then the inner sphere is judged as love of fame. If it is altogether conformity with the position of the individual without going beyond this position, and so constituted that the individuality in question does not have the position attached to it as an external feature, but through itself supplies concrete filling to this universality, and by that very process shows itself to be capable of a higher station, then the inner nature of the act is judged as ambition, and so on. Since in the act in general, the individual who acts comes to see himself in objective form, or gets the feeling of his own being in his objective existence and thus attains enjoyment, the judgment on the act finds the inner nature of it to be an impulse toward personal happiness, even though this happiness were to consist merely in inner moral vanity, the enjoyment of a sense of personal excellence, and in the foretaste and the hope of happiness to come. No act can escape being judged in such a way. For duty's sake, this pure purpose is something unreal. What reality it has lies in the deed of some individuality, and the action thereby has in it the aspect of particularity. No hero is a hero to his valet, not because the hero is not the hero, but because the valet is the valet, with whom the hero has to do, not as hero, but as a man who eats, drinks, and dresses, who in short appears as a private individual with certain personal wants and ideas of his own. In the same way, there is no act in which the process of judgment cannot oppose the personal aspect of individuality to the universal agent of the act, and play the part of the moral valet towards the agent. The consciousness that so passes judgment is in consequence itself base and mean, because it divides the act up and produces and holds to the act self-discordant. It is furthermore hypocrisy, because it gives out this way of judging, not as another fashion of being wicked, but as the correct consciousness of the act, sets itself up in its unreality, in this vanity of knowing well and better, far above the deeds it decries, and wants to find its mere words without deeds taken for an admirable kind of reality. On this account, then, putting itself on level with the agent on whom it passes judgment, is recognized by the latter as the same as himself. The latter does not merely find himself apprehended as something alien to and discordant with that other, but rather finds the other in its peculiar constitutive character identical with himself. Seeing this identity and giving this expression, he openly confesses himself to the other, and expects in like manner that the other, having in point of fact put himself on the same level, will respond in the same language, will therein give voice to his identity, and thus the state of mutual recognition will be brought about. His confession is not an attitude of abasement or humiliation before the other, it is not throwing himself away, for to give the matter expression in this way has not the one-sided character which would fix and establish his disparity with the other. On the contrary, it is solely because of seeing the identity of the other with him that he gives himself utterance. In making his confession, he announces from his side their common identity, and does so for the reason that language is the existence of spirit as an immediate self. He thus expects that the other will make its own contribution into this manner of existence. But the admission on the part of the one who is wicked, "I am so," is not followed by a reply making a similar confession. This was not what that way of judging meant at all. Far from it. It repels this community of nature, and is the hard-heartedness which keeps to itself and rejects all continuity with the other. By so doing, the scene is changed. The one who made the confession sees himself thrust off, and takes the other to be in the wrong when he refuses to let his own inner nature go forth in the objective shape of an express utterance, which, when he contrasts the beauty of his own soul with the wicked individual, and opposes to the confession of the penitent the stiff-necked attitude of the self-consistent, equitable character, and the rigid silence of one who keeps himself to himself and refuses to throw himself away for someone else. Here we find asserted the highest pitch of revolt to which a spirit certain of itself can reach. For it beholds itself qua this simple self-knowledge in another conscious being, and in such a way that even the external form of the other is not an unessential thing, as in the case of an object of wealth, but sought. Knowledge itself is what is held opposed to it. Is this absolutely fluid continuity of pure knowledge, which refuses to establish communication with an other, which had ipso facto, by making its confession, renounced separate, isolated self-existence, had affirmed its particularity to be cancelled and thereby established itself as continuous with the other, in essence established itself as universal. The other, however, in its own case, reserves for itself its uncommunicative, isolated independence. In the case of the individual confessing, it reserves for him the very same independence, though the latter has already cast that away. It thereby proves itself to be a form of consciousness which is forsaken by and denies the very nature of spirit, for it does not understand that spirit, in the absolute certainty of itself, is master and lord over every deed and over all reality, and can reject and cast them off and make them as if they had never been. At the same time, it does not see the contradiction it is committing in not allowing a rejection, which has been made in express language, to pass for genuine rejection, which itself has the certainty of its own spiritual life, not in the concrete real act, but in its inner nature, and finds the objective existence of this inner being in the language of its own judgment. It is thus its own self which checks that other's return from the act to the spiritual objectivity of language and to spiritual identity, and by its harshness produces this discordance which still remains. Now, so far as the spirit, which is certain of itself in the form of a beautiful soul, does not possess the strength to relinquish the self-absorbed, uncommunicative knowledge of itself, it cannot attain to any identity with the consciousness that is repulsed, and so cannot succeed in seeing the unity of itself in another life, cannot reach objective existence. The identity comes about, therefore, merely in a negative way, as a state of being devoid of spiritual character. The beautiful soul, then, has no concrete reality. It subsists in the contradiction between its pure self and the necessity felt by the self to externalize itself and turn into something actual. It exists in the immediacy of this rooted and fixed opposition, an immediacy which alone is the middle term reconciling an opposition which has been intensified to its pure abstraction and is pure being or empty nothingness. Thus the beautiful soul, being conscious of this contradiction in its unreconciled immediacy, is unhinged, disordered, and runs to madness, wastes itself in yearning, and pines away in consumption. Thereby it gives up as a fact its stubborn insistence on its own isolated self-existence, but only to bring forth the soulless, spiritless unity of abstract being. The true, that is to say the self-conscious, and actual adjustment of the two sides is necessitated by an already contained in the foregoing. Breaking the hard heart and raising it to the level of universality is the same process which was expressed in the case of consciousness that openly made its confession. The wounds of the spirit heal and leave no scars behind. The deed is not the imperishable element. Spirit takes it back into itself, and the aspect of individuality present in it, whether in the form of an intention or an existential negativity and limitation, is that which immediately passes away. The self which realizes, in essence, the form of the spirit's act, is merely a moment of the whole, and the same is true of the knowledge functioning through judgment, and establishing and maintaining the distinction between the individual and universal aspects of action. The evil consciousness above spoken of affirms the externalization of itself, or asserts itself as a moment being drawn into the way of express confession by seeing itself in another. This other, however, must have its one-sided, unaccepted, and unacknowledged judgment broken down, just as the former has to abandon its one-sided, unacknowledged existence in a state of particularity and isolation. And as the former displays the power of spirit over its reality, so the other must manifest the power of spirit over its constitutive determinate notion. The latter, however, renounces the sort that divides and separates, and the harshness of the self-existence which holds to such sort, for the reason that in point of fact it sees itself in the first. That which in this way abandons its reality and makes itself into a superseded particular, this displays itself thereby as in fact universal. It turns away from its external reality back into itself as inner essence, and there the universal consciousness thus knows and finds itself. The forgiveness it extends to the first is the renunciation of self, of its unreal essence, since it identifies with this essence that other which was real action, and recognizes what was called bad, a determination assigned to action by sort, to be good. Or rather, it lets go and gives up this distinction of determinate sort with its self-existent determining judgment, just as the other forgoes determining the act in isolation and for its own private behoof. The word of reconciliation is the objectively existent spirit, which immediately apprehends the pure knowledge of itself qua universal essence in its opposite, in the pure knowledge of itself qua absolutely self-confined single individual, a reciprocal recognition which is absolute spirit. Absolute spirit enters existence merely at the culminating point at which its pure knowledge about itself is opposition and interchange within itself. Knowing that pure knowledge is the abstract, essential reality, absolute spirit is this knowing duty in absolute opposition to the knowledge which knows itself, qua absolute singleness of self, to be the essentially real. The former is the pure continuity of the universal, which knows the individuality that knows itself, the real, to be inherently naught, to be evil. The latter again is absolute discreteness, which knows itself absolute in its pure oneness, and knows the universal is the unreal, which exists only for others. Both aspects are refined and clarified to this degree of purity, where there is no selfless existence left, no negative of consciousness in either of them, where instead the one element of duty is the self-identical character of its self-knowledge, and the other element of evil equally has its purpose in its own inner being, and its reality in its own mode of utterance. The content of this utterance is the substance that gives the spirit subsistence. The utterance is the assumption of the certainty of spirit within its own self. These spirits, both certain of themselves, have each no other purpose than its own pure self, and no other reality in existence than just this pure self. But they are still different, and the difference is absolute, because holding within this element of the pure notion, the difference is absolute too, not merely for us, tracing the experience, but for the notions themselves, which stand in this opposition. For while these notions are indeed determinate and specific relatively to one another, they are at the same time in themselves universal, so they fill out the whole range of the self, and this self has no other content than that its own determinate constitution, which neither transcends the self nor is more restricted than it. For the one factor, the absolutely universal, is pure self-knowledge, as well as the other, the absolute discreteness of single individuality, and both are merely this pure self-knowledge. Both determinate factors, then, are cognizing pure notions which know qua notions, those very determinateness is immediately knowing, or in other words, whose relationship and opposition is the ego. Because of this, they are for one another these absolute opposites. It is what is completely inner that has in this way come into opposition to itself and earned objective existence. They constitute pure knowledge, which, owing to this opposition, takes the form of consciousness. But as yet it is not self-consciousness. It obtains this actualization in the course of the process through which this opposition passes. For this opposition is really itself the indiscrete continuity and identity of ego equals ego, and each by itself inherently cancels itself just through the contradiction in its pure universality, which, while implying continuity and identity, at the same time still resists this identity with the other and separates itself from it. Through this relinquishment of separate selfhood, the knowledge, which in its existence is in a state of diremption, returns into the unity of the self. It is the concrete actual ego, universal knowledge of self, on its absolute opposite. In the knowledge which is internal and within the self, and which, because of the very purity of its separate subjective existence, is itself completely universal. The reconciling affirmation, the yes, with which both egos desist from their existence in opposition, is the existence of the ego expanded into duality. An ego which remains therein one and identical with itself, and possesses the certainty of itself in its complete relinquishment and its opposite, is God appearing in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge.